Welcome to the Springs in the Desert podcast. We're those friends that you can take with you wherever you are on the path of infertility.
Hello and welcome back to the Springs in the Desert podcast. I am Anne, and I am so excited to be joined by a great friend of our ministry and also a really great personal friend of mine, Clare Kane. Hi, Clare.
Hi, Anne. I'm so thrilled and grateful to be welcomed back. Thank you so much for having me.
It is always wonderful to have you, especially as we begin a new month and a new theme for our ministry. So this month, our theme is hope and new beginnings. And I think that's very fitting for the springtime, right? Because it's a time when we think about renewal and new life. And so we thought it might be interesting to approach this theme by taking a closer look at the theological virtues. Now, these are those virtues that St. Paul mentions, and their faith, hope, and love. With this first episode, we're going to dive into faith. And since we have Clare, who is a psychotherapist, very fancy, but also a theologian, we're going to tap on kind of her expertise in both of those lanes and ask her to wear both of those hats and begin our discussion of faith from a kind of a unique angle, Clare, that you and I talked about, and maybe a little bit of twist, a kind of a twist that people might not be expecting. So first, Clare, I want to ask you to put on your theologian hat and just explain a little bit what we mean by the virtue of faith.
So the virtue of faith is the gift of grace, right? The specific grace to believe and to trust that what God has said about himself and who he is in Revelation and what the deposit of faith that the church holds teaches us about him is true. It is the grace to enter into that belief, to hold fast to it, and to grow in it, right? That's what the theological virtue of faith is. So the kind of the tack or the way into this mystery, right? Because grace is a mystery, right? The way into how do we delve into what faith is in lived experience? An interesting way to do it is to look at faith in its aspect of knowledge and understanding, right? So because faith as a virtue is about belief in someone. And we cannot believe in someone unless we know that one. And that knowledge leads to trust in that one, which is then faith in that one. But those really key aspects, those maybe we could call them sub-virtues, right? Minor virtues that assist the work of grace of faith is knowledge and trust. And one way that we can talk about those in terms of practical life for many listeners out there would be, how do we live that virtue of faith in marriage? How do we live a faithful marriage?
I really love that setup that you gave, Clare, because I think sometimes, even if we're strong Catholics or Christians and we say that we have faith, sometimes I think we're almost not even sure what that means, or we just kind of think of it in terms of a set of beliefs, which is important. There are certain tenets or precepts, the commandments that we believe in, that they are the pillars of our faith. But I really like how you put it in terms of a relationship, and that we're not simply believing in or having faith in a set of principles, but in a real person, in three persons, in the Trinity, and that faith entails a relationship. So I think it's really important to put it in that context, because when we're talking about things that are religious, or we're talking about Catholicism or Christianity, we can sometimes forget that our God is a personal God, right? He is in relationship with us. So I think that's a really great foundation and kind of a nice way to put on your other hat as a therapist, right, and tie that into our relationships within marriage. And of course, our listeners are mostly here because they are also in this experience of infertility or loss, that it's part of their walk right now, or maybe it has been in the past. And so let's dive into this idea of faith, this beautiful grace of faith, and then how it relates to our marital relationship.
I think these assistive virtues, maybe the helper virtues here of knowledge and trust, right? In a marriage, those are really the foundation of faithful marriages. Faithful both in terms of being united through the sacrament of marriage to Christ's love in the church, right? So the grace of the sacramental love Christ has for the church is flowing through those marriages, right? So I think sometimes that's something we forget. You and I have talked about that. You forget that sometimes. But also that sort of faith in your spouse, right? Faith in who they are, who they've said they are, in the ways that they're going to be present for you, be predictable, be attuned, right? All those like really important, crucial choices people make to form lasting, stable, loving attachments. All of those are based on knowledge. And I think sometimes we go into, I have talked with a lot of couples, both preparing for marriage and married couples who come in for counseling for many different reasons. And often somehow there's been like a disconnect about their knowledge of this person. Either they stopped working on knowing each other at some point, or they're going into a marriage, those who are in like premarital counseling, going into it being like, I don't know if I actually do know this person. And that's, as a therapist, I love that because, okay, great. We haven't hit the wedding date yet. Let's get into this. Let's get to know each other, because it will only grow, in a sense. It's more work to know your spouse, which is so interesting. I think it's more work sometimes to know your spouse and to make room in yourself for that knowledge of who they are.
Yeah, that's so interesting in terms of marriage preparation and that process of getting to know your spouse. Of course, the whole time that you're dating and you're engaged, it's all about getting to know each other. But we know that as human persons, we are mysteries, which means there's always like more to us. Mm-hmm. There's always more to discover and to learn. And there's only so much probably that you can learn in that preparation time, right? Hopefully, if there's any red flags, you learn those pretty quickly and can move on from there. But this idea that even after we're married, that it's a continual sort of process of learning and getting to know each other, I think isn't important. Maybe you can say a little bit more about that, because I feel like sometimes once we're married, we feel like, okay, that's it. Now we belong to each other. And so all the secrets are unlocked and that's it. And this is how I expect you're going to behave and respond. Yes. And then when you don't, I'm like, gosh, who are you? And particularly then add on something like an experience of infertility or the loss of a child. And then your head is really spinning.
Yeah. And I think there's, as you're asking that question, it makes me think of something my husband said once. I think this was shortly after we were married. We're celebrating our 13th anniversary this summer. I always forget the date. I think it's May 29th. He always remembers. I always forget. Yeah. But 13 very happy years. But shortly after we were married, he said something where we're talking about joking with each other. We got married in our later 30s and you were late. It took so long. We're joking. And he said, I realized at a certain point in my single life, in probably his early 30s, he said, I realized there were certain things I would not be able to learn about the Lord, like not to know deeply and know about myself until I was with my spouse. And I was like, oh, I'm going to have to think about that for a little bit.
No pressure, Claire.
No pressure. I know, exactly. But no, and it was so funny. No, it's not that like you have to do anything. It's more that like the discovery of ourselves and other people, like it happens in relationships. And like the way that we understand ourselves comes through making space for understanding other people and who they are, especially in marriage. And as you said, this sort of, there is a deep mystery in the other person. You're never going to be able to know the way they experience their inner life in its fullness. And especially when moments of sorrow and real suffering come, like infertility, the loss of a child, those become crucibles for knowing each other, for being able to rest in knowledge of each other, and also to like cling to the fact that there's more to know and more good to know about who the other person is. And again, that's not pressure. It's both gift and task, right? I know this person's going to be present for me, but there may be changes in the way they can be present. And those may be positive or really challenging, right? But all of this is like the work of knowledge and trust.
So I think this is a really important point and an important conversation for our listeners, because when you are in a marriage in so many ways is hard enough because there are all kinds of challenges that come at us that we don't necessarily expect. But when you face a kind of a crisis like infertility, for example, something that you really didn't expect, because we do have these expectations. Okay, we're getting married, we're doing everything the right way. We have faith, as we just spoke about. And then those expectations, those desires aren't realized. And we can, I think, either isolate ourselves from each other, or we can just feel like, gosh, I don't know where to turn. I don't know what to do. We can feel stuck. So how can we engage in this process of getting to know each other more and better together, rather than isolating from each other and turning it into some kind of opposition?
Hey friends, it is your podcast host, Jillian. Just popping into this episode to ask you to consider supporting our podcast with a financial gift. This episode is brought to you by staff, volunteers who reviewed the content, and a professional editor. We would be so grateful for your financial support to keep this podcast sounding great and reaching more listeners who need a friend on the path of infertility. Thank you for your support.
Yeah, that can really happen. To use an analogous phrase, right? I think this came out of the First World War. Like, God is found and lost in foxholes, right? That's where you find him in these moments of intense crisis. You either find the Lord or you lose him in those moments. And I do think that is very similar to what can sometimes happen in marriage in these moments of crisis. You either find each other in new, profound ways. You find a way to anchor yourselves in each other and the Lord, or things go south. And that doesn't mean they're unrecoverable. That's not what I mean. Or that you have to do this perfectly. Nobody's going to do this perfectly. But I do think that there are, to go for the most obvious, banal, but really crucial, is communication. You got to be talking. You got to be talking. You got to be talking together. You got to be talking in quiet moments when you can get them. I am a big fan of talking in the car. I think sometimes big conversations actually can be really helpful in the car, because some people just are not particularly comfortable about staring into someone's eyes. Tell me all your deepest feelings, right? Sometimes having a mutual activity that is calm, quiet enough, that stream of stimuli is controllable enough that you can actually access some deeper stuff. That can be really helpful. So finding a way to communicate about some of these deeper issues, and at the same time, without trying to suppress, stuff down any of your feelings about what's happening, making room for play. I know this is something we've talked about. Some of the other things we've talked about, I feel like in a weird way, this has become like one of my soapboxes, is that like joy in marriage, especially in moments of crisis, like you gotta look for the joy. And you got to follow it when you find it. That doesn't mean avoidance, because sometimes positive distractions can be a path to avoidance of what's actually happening or what someone is really feeling. Taking humor is a wonderful coping mechanism, but it can become a means of deflection of what's really happening. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about finding the silly, finding the dark humor in what's going on, right? And connecting in those moments of knowledge can be really powerful.
That's great. Those are two very important points. I think communication always, and I think we can't hammer that one home enough, that the communication is so crucial. But I also love that you brought in this idea of play. And I think that can be particularly tough when we are in a tender season like this,
Yes.
because we can feel guilty. Number one, we can feel like we're goofing off on the job. Right? Our focus, our job is to try to conceive and do all the things. And so if we're not hyper focused on that, there's something wrong. Or we can feel guilty about it. Like maybe other people are looking at us and saying, oh, sure, you don't have any children, so you can go on vacation, or you can just take that time off and just do whatever you want. And so there's a lot of kind of complicated emotions that come with things that seem so simple, like talking with each other, making time for each other, and just enjoying each other.
Yes. No, I think it's really crucial. And I think it harkens back to something we talked about on the previous podcast, is that this disconnect sometimes between the unitive and the procreative aspects of marriage, right? It still happens inside faithful marriages. And I think sometimes it can happen to a very painful degree inside marriages where couples are really struggling with this cross of suffering of infertility and or pregnancy loss, because it can become really mechanistic. You can be focused on the procreative at the expense of the unitive. And I'm just going to go out there. Unitive is always first, because the unitive aspect is what makes the procreative possible. And so there is a primacy there that's really important. And I think sometimes that's so painful. There were seasons when, even we're studying, right? We're studying all this stuff, and that was hurtful to me. I'm like, no, I'm supposed to be a mom. This is supposed to be what's happening. And that shift over time to realize in this vocation, I don't get to choose what fruitfulness looks like. I don't get to choose how this procreative faculty that I and my husband together have. I do not have a choice about what that fruit looks like. I certainly have a choice about entering into the unitive in the hope and faithful expectation, the trust that this is going to be fruitful. And when I have allowed that to happen, beautiful things have come. Beautiful things have come.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a hard truth to hear, that we don't have a choice in how the fruitfulness of our marriage is going to end up being expressed. It'll be expressed in many ways. Even if we end up having children, if we have a ton of children, there are still more ways that our marriages are called to be fruitful. But of course, when we're walking on this path, it can be so difficult to have that faith, right? Because we can feel like God is letting us down, or we let God down, and maybe he's mad at us, or he's abandoning us, or for whatever reason, he's not blessing us. And so how can we together in our marriage, because I think we each have, of course, our own personal faith in the Lord. We have our own prayer life. But in marriage, I think it's so important for us to be together in this pursuit of faith, in this pursuit of love and relationship with the Lord. How can we do that, especially in a tender season like infertility or experiencing loss?
One sort of practical suggestion. This is something my husband and I literally stumbled onto, and I have talked, I don't know how we started it, honestly. It started the morning after our wedding. So 13 years ago now. And I have talked with a lot of people, shared it, because I thought a lot of people did this, and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to try that. So here's what we do. In the morning before my husband goes to work, he leaves very early. He's a school teacher. A high school teacher starts very early. And I'm usually the kids aren't up yet. So I'm in bed, half asleep. So he'll come over and we pray with each other for 15 seconds. Lord, bless my husband's Wade, bless Wade's day, fill him up with your peace. If I happen to have enough brain cells firing to remember that there's something it's a big meeting or something, I pray with that. He does the same for me. At the end of the night, right before we're going to bed, sometimes it's just a Hail Mary because we're fried, right? Totally fried. Right. But often it's, hey, what would you like prayer for? I ask him, what would you like? He asks, what would you like prayer for? And this time it's maybe 60 seconds. We're not talking about a huge amount of time. When I can't even express how fruitful that has been for us. But our day begins in prayer together and our day ends. It's the bookends of our lives are just sandwiched between prayer together. And that has been so enormously fruitful. And especially I find the evening prayer, sometimes he'll say something or he'll tell me I said something I add to what I'm praying for. And I can't believe you said that. That was exactly what's been on my mind. I think we forget, right? That in this sacrament, we are our job is to love our spouse into heaven. That's our job. Doesn't mean that we're annihilating ourselves. It simply means being present, predictable, attuned, and loving in the ways that we can to that person. And his job is to do that for me. And that just small reminder, 30 seconds in the morning and 60 seconds in the evening, man, that has been really fruitful for us.
That is so great. I love it because it's simple.
Yep.
And there's not a ton of pressure we have to say all these prayers or we have to remember all these people. And of course, listen, we can expand on our prayer time with each other too. There's no limit. We can take longer time if we need to, but even just setting aside that short amount of time in the morning and the evening is so great. And I also loved it because you hit in that example on two things that we talked about at the top of this episode, and that was knowledge.
Yeah.
By entering into prayer, you are actually learning about each other.
Yes.
Right? Like
absolutely.
What you just shared, how your husband said, oh my gosh, I was thinking that exact same thing. So you're getting more attuned to each other. And communication, you're not just communicating with God, you're communicating with each other. You're communicating your needs or your fears, or maybe your joy over something great that happened that day. And so it's so interesting, isn't it, how our life of faith and our marriage life, in some ways, they're not two separate things. They really are one.
No, it's true. I think very often I forget which Hans von Balthasar book, right? When he's doing that reflection on baptism, on the sacraments, and he said, if our baptismal vow is a vow in which we are united with Christ, the shape of how that unity is lived in the world is taken up by our vocation. Like in a real sense, like our vocation is the shape our baptismal vow takes in the world. And I think it's like that, they are one and the same. Like, I'm not going to be asked, why wasn't I this same? Why wasn't I that? I'm going to be asked, like, how were you yourself and Wade's wife?
I love that. That's I think a beautiful way to wrap up this conversation. We could keep going and break out this idea of faith so much more, but listeners, we would love to hear from you. How are you putting your faith into action, not only personally in your personal prayer time, but how are you and your spouse putting your faith in the Lord into action and your faith in each other? So please let us know. Clare, it was so great to be with you. I know we are going to have you back for more conversations.
Oh, thank you so much, Anne. This has been a joy. Such a great time.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all for listening. And until next time, God bless you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Springs in the Desert podcast episode. We would be so grateful if you took a minute to rate and review us so that we can reach more listeners. Don't forget to check out our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, and go to our website, springsinthedesert.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter and community prayer list, read our blog, and register for virtual and in-person events. Most importantly, remember that God loves you so much, and so do we.